Thank you, please. Please. Please, very nice of you. Not necessary, although always welcome. Danny, thank you very much for that kind introduction. And Bob, thanks for hosting us here today at the Family Leadership Summit. It's a real honor to be back in Iowa, back with my good colleagues, your great senators, Chuck Grassley and Joni Ernst, as well as so many other senators who are traveling here to speak to you today. Now, I have to tell you, I'll admit, we're kind of the backup. We're the B team, or even the understudies, if you will. You may not have heard this. It's true. Bob, I think it's true, that he invited 7 Democratic senators running for president. So you could have had 7 senators, besides me and James Lankford, Tim Scott, Ben Sass, Joni Ernst. I'm sure it would have been great. I'm sure that Bernie Sanders would fit in very well here. Or I can't even remember the other ones' names. There's so many of them running, to be honest. But no, you got us instead. Although I have to say, you almost didn't get us. We had some pretty bad storms in Washington yesterday. We were supposed to fly out last night, I think at 8 o'clock. We ended up flying out at about 11 o'clock, getting in at 1:30. And on that plane was not just Chuck Grassley and Joni Ernst and me and Tim Scott and James Lankford. So you would have had a lot of great faith leaders talking to you today. Maybe not as many politicians. Perhaps that would have been better, though. But we all got in about 1:30 this morning, I guess. But we're glad to be here and glad to be speaking to you. I'll confess that it was a little bit of a blessing for me. I have 2 young boys, as Danny said, Gabriel, age 4, and Daniel, age 2. So the delayed flight meant that I had a chance to actually have dinner with them and put them to bed, which I don't get to do enough, frankly. I'd like to do more. Sometimes bedtime can be challenging. Just the other day, Gabriel, my 4-year-old, asked if I would tell him the story about when Mommy and Daddy got married. I said, yeah, I'd be happy to tell you that story, Gabriel. Just telling him about how our families gathered together, and we'd had dinner the night beforehand with our families, and then we both woke up. But we didn't get to see each other because you don't get to see your bride on the day of your wedding. And then we all gathered together, and the doors opened, and your mommy was there in a beautiful wedding dress. He said, was she the most beautiful mommy in the world? I said, of course she was the most beautiful mommy in the world. And then he said, where was I? And I said, well, you weren't there, son. It's like, where was I? It's like, well, you weren't here yet. Which, in retrospect, was a mistake, because he said, where was I when I wasn't here, Daddy? And then I stuck my foot in my mouth even more. I said, well, you didn't exist yet, son. He said, where was I when I didn't exist, Daddy? So I said, well, son, you were with the Lord at home. It's like, where's the Lord's home, Daddy? I said, let's just say it's in heaven like you hear in church. It's like, but ultimately, your mother and I were very blessed because God created you. How did God create me, Daddy? Ultimately, I got him off of that, but I did go back to my wife, who was reading in our bedroom, and I told her this story. And she said, Tom, don't raise those kind of questions with him. I said, honey, Jeremiah 1:5. Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before I set you apart, I knew you. And she said, Tom, I know Jeremiah 1:5. He's 4 years old. Talk about Charlie Brown. But she's back. She's back home today with Gabriel and with Daniel, our 2.5-year-old, who's going through potty training. So please say a prayer for him. I see all the moms out there nodding. Maybe I should say a prayer for her. But I am very glad to be here with you at this summit. When you think about a summit, oftentimes you think about meetings between leaders of nations, kind of summits we used to see between, say, Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev in the late days of the Cold War. And those kind of summits bring together people of very different viewpoints, very oftentimes adversarial viewpoints. Of course, that's not what we have here today. We have hundreds of Bible-believing Christians of a variety of faiths and denominations, to be sure. Methodists, Baptists, Lutherans, and so on and so forth. But all committed to one single faith. And ensuring, as Bob said, that faith remains strong and vibrant in our families, in our communities, in our government, despite our differences. and we do have some small differences. You know, when I grew up, as Danny said, in Dardanelle, Arkansas, I grew up a Methodist. Right across the street from us was the Baptist church. Right across the other street was the Presbyterian church. When I was a young boy, not knowing much else, I thought the differences were pretty vast. Maybe the biggest difference I noticed was every Sunday of who could get out of church first to get to the only Mexican restaurant in town for lunch. But over time, I began to realize that what unites us is a lot more important than what separates our different varieties of faith. You know, Mike Huckabee was governor of Arkansas for 10 years and has become a friend of mine, used to say, and when he talked to the various denominations, said, you know, when you sit down for a family meal and you serve soup, some people like their soup hot, some people like their soup cold, but ultimately it's the same soup. That lesson was reinforced to me when I spent the first Sunday of my life in the Army. Stanley said I spent about 5 years in the Army. Now, what he didn't say is that I went in a somewhat unusual fashion, that I started out in college and then law school and then a lawyer, but I redeemed myself by joining the Army. I did go in as an infantry officer, though, which meant I went through basic training just like every other young soldier. I didn't go to a special set of training for JAG officers. And that first week of basic training is a lot of process, a lot of details, a lot of trying to get your ducks in a row so you can train drill sergeants. And I see some heads nodding. I know that some people here have been through the kind of basic training. The drill sergeants have a lot of work they've got to do before they can even start teaching you to be a soldier. They've got to catalog who's got diseases or allergies, whose uniforms fit, who doesn't, what kind of tattoos you have, where are they, what do they look like. And then Sunday morning, Drill Sergeant Parks walks in. We didn't really know what to expect. For the first time in 7 days, we had a training calendar that was empty between breakfast and lunch. And Drill Sergeant Park walks in. He said, all right, privates, get on the line. Get on the line. It's a square rectangle at the end of our bunks. We got on the line to whatever the drill sergeant was going to say to you. It's like, okay, we're going to religious services, privates. Anybody wants to go to religious services? Line up. There are 3 lines. There are 3 lines and only 3 lines, privates. Protestant, Catholic, and other. That's it. I don't want to hear anything more, privates. Just get in line. I don't want to hear about Methodist and Baptist and Southern Methodist and Lutheran, Missouri Synod and United Lutheran. I want to see Protestant. And if you're Catholic, you know who you are. Get in the Catholic line. If you're Orthodox, you probably belong in the Catholic line too. They'll sort it out at church. And if you don't fit in those categories, I want you in the other line, privates. If you're Jewish or Muslim, if you want to dance around a fire, if you want to do yoga, get in the other line. So we got in line, like Drill Sergeant Park said, that January Sunday at Fort Jackson, South Carolina, and we marched the mile to church. It's an important reminder, I thought, given the number of people that went, just how strong the patriotic streak in our faith in our churches are. As many of you probably saw this last weekend in your churches for 4th of July, or a few weeks ago for Memorial Day, or as we see every Veterans Day, just how many of the young privates marched off to church that morning. Now, I'll admit some of them marched off to church just because they probably wanted to get away from Drill Sergeant Parks. Maybe they heard that they served fruit punch and cookies after church. But they also found God in those stressful times, either there or overseas as well. But of course, I got in the Protestant line. But that morning at Fort Jackson and the following 8 weeks, or then when I went to Fort Benning for officer candidate school and Ranger school, when our chaplain was a former Army Ranger who'd heard the calling of God and the Army had sent back to seminary, gave us his testimony up on Yonah Mountain in the middle of the night underneath the stars. Every military base I was at after that, Fort Campbell, Fort Myer, Fort Bragg, or the kind of makeshift chapels we had overseas in Baghdad or Kabul, Medellin, Afghanistan. Or when I served with the Old Guard at Arlington National Cemetery between my combat tours, presiding over military honor funerals as we laid to rest our fallen heroes and our veterans from the greatest generation. They all drove home the same point, that whatever small differences we have among us as Bible-believing Christians, they are far outweighed by what we have in common, the bedrock of our faith, the inspired Word of God, the biblical Scripture. Because when you're a military chaplain, you can't minister to Methodists or Baptists or Lutherans. And when you're downrange, you may not even be able to minister differently between, say, Protestants and Catholics or Eastern Orthodox. You minister that common biblical faith that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, and He was sent to save us and redeem us of our sins. That you see that everywhere you go across the military. And that's the way it's been from the very beginning for our country. You know, we just celebrated our Independence Day from 1776, announced in that magisterial document, the Declaration of Independence. But America goes back far before that. America was first populated by religious pilgrims who were seeking to escape persecution in Europe so they could practice their own faith and worship their God by the dictates of their own conscience. That's one reason we call it the first freedom of all of our freedoms, because if you don't have the freedom of religion, what other freedom do you have? And that's been the American tradition from the very beginning. If you look at the rightly and justly famous letter that President George Washington wrote in 1790 to the Hebrew congregation in Newport, Rhode Island, a congregation that went back at that point more than 100 years, in which he addressed the children of the stock of Abraham, as he said, "We have set up in our nation liberty of conscience, where every man and woman can worship God according to the dictates of their conscience." And he spoke briefly about toleration. He said that in America we have actually moved beyond toleration, which had been the watchword for years, centuries in Europe, to escape the wars of great religion there in the 16 and 1700s. Because toleration implies that the power of society, whether it's a king or a majority, allows a minority to practice its faith only as an indulgence, only as something they grant as a license, as opposed to what George Washington said, it being an inherent natural right of mankind. And that's why Washington said in this country we give no sanction to bigotry, no assistance to persecution. He said here in America, everyone can live and thrive under the safety of their own vine and fig tree, a phrase in the Old Testament that he loved so much. Unfortunately today, that's not always the case. We, people of the faith, are not always left to flourish under our own vine and fig tree. We face a kind of aggressive secular liberalism that wants to also, in its own way, move beyond toleration. But that's not just for toleration of those who might disagree with us or who have different viewpoints. They don't just ask for acceptance, they ask for celebration. And they enforce that demand for celebration with a rigid, aggressive, almost suffocating political correctness that threatens to infringe on all of our rights of conscience. Not just worship, what we do in church or when we gather in settings like this, but faith, the way we live our life every single day in our schools, in our businesses, in our communities. Think about, for instance, what a Democratic presidential candidate said just a couple weeks ago, attacking the Republican Party, saying that it's the height of hypocrisy for a party that claims the mantle of God to defend the separation of parents from children at our southern border. Now, I would say that it might be the height of hypocrisy for a politician to claim the mantle of God when he's willing to see a child ripped from its mother's womb in the 9th month of pregnancy. More fundamentally, I would say what Abraham Lincoln said is, I worry less about getting God on my side and my party side than I do getting on God's side, because God is never wrong. Or think about what a man named Jack Phillips has faced in Colorado. Many of you may know him as the owner and artisan of Masterpiece Cake. 3 times, 3 different occasions, the forces of left-wing political correctness have tried to put him out of business for simply living his faith through his expressive activities of baking and making cakes for weddings or anniversaries, childbirth, what have you. First, it was private lawsuits by a gay couple that wanted a cake made for their wedding, something that he said violated his religious faith, and something for which there were many other cake shops all around town. Ultimately prevailed in that lawsuit, but then the power of the government in the form of the Colorado Civil Rights Commission charged him for violating their human rights laws. Went all the way up to the Supreme Court. Just last year he won, and he won in part because of what the Supreme Court says was the open, bigoted attacks on his religious faith by those commissioners. You would think after all those years they would just give it a rest. But no, they went straight back to court with him. Now Jack Phillips is being charged again because he wouldn't bake a cake to celebrate the transition of a transgendered person. All of these liberals in Colorado need to get a life and find something better to do with their time than persecute a man who simply wants to live out his faith in an expressive activity. Think about the organization that defended Jack Phillips, that defends so many Christian and other faith-based organizations, the Alliance Defending Freedom. Why do I bring them up? Well, one, I bet several of you work with them or support them or at least admire them. They've been targeted as a hate group, akin to a noxious, racist organization like the KKK by an organization called the Southern Poverty Law Center. You may not have heard of them, based in Alabama, but I can assure you they've been in the news a lot, even if you don't know their name. They sit on a $500 million endowment, $500 million. They're frequently cited by the left-wing media as an expert on hate groups, organizations in their mind like the Alliance Defending Freedom, which, by the way, has a much better record at the Supreme Court than they do or the ACLU does. They've been targeted for removal from social media platforms in which they can raise money from like-minded Americans across the country, all because they're willing to defend people like Jack Phillips. The Southern Poverty Law Center also singled out the Family Research Council as a so-called hate group. And partly as a result, it went far beyond simply removing them from a social media website. A deranged man walked into the headquarters of the Family Research Council a few years ago and started shooting. And he said that was in part because of their designation as a hate group by the Southern Poverty Law Center. In his backpack were several Chick-fil-A sandwiches that he planned to smear in the face of his victims as a symbolic gesture of their hatred. And as the speech you just saw that I gave on the Senate floor a few weeks ago, people of faith don't just face this kind of discrimination, even persecution or attacks from our government, whether in the form of the Colorado Civil Rights Commission or the Obama administration. It's from corporate America as well. Politically correct CEOs who want company men and women, not family men and women, who will take in a full-page ad with Planned Parenthood, a full-page ad in the New York Times. That is not cheap. Signed by 180 CEOs, almost exclusively from the East and the West Coast, trying to tell us how we should live our lives in Iowa or Arkansas or Georgia. Some of that is related to the kind of laws that our legislatures have passed to protect the most innocent among us, unborn children. Hollywood studios have threatened to boycott the state of Georgia, which has a huge and growing film industry, because of that law. Arkansas has passed a similar law. Perhaps we'll be next, or perhaps Iowa as well. Some of these companies, like And Pizza, they are willing to attack states that want to protect the unborn. They don't even give paid maternity leave to women working for them. They will pay for you to get a tattoo of the company logo on your skin, though, if you want to get a sense of their priorities. Why is it, though, we never hear from CEOs who represent in their workforce many moms and dads about the kind of, let's be honest, depraved laws that states like Illinois and New York and Vermont have passed that truly do immunize abortion up to the moment of birth or even after birth? And I'm not kidding about this. Because of the law New York passed, a man who stabbed to death his pregnant girlfriend will now face 1 count of homicide under New York law, not 2, for killing her unborn child. These are the kind of currents in which we're operating, the kind of choppy waters that we face in our society today. What is to be done? I think, as you heard Bob said, that in many ways culture is upstream of politics. And that for us and for people like you gathered in this hall today, the times demand that you lock arms and stand together and defend the faith against that aggressive, politically correct orthodoxy that would be imposed upon us. When I think about locking arms, despite whatever small differences we might have, and defending our faith, I think of a story that I suspect some of you know. The so-called immortal chaplains who perished in 1943. They were aboard the SS Dorchester, a troop transport ship. Had about 900 soldiers for whom they were the men of the cloth, bound for Greenland in February 1943. A German U-boat hit the Dorchester with a fatal blow in the middle of the night. Those chaplains, 2 Protestants, 1 Catholic, 1 rabbi, they'd fit right in at Fort Jackson, South Carolina, put on their life jackets. They're all older than the young soldiers they had. They calmed them down. They moved them from the undercarriage, got them topside, got them into life jackets, got them into lifeboats, only to realize that this recently converted civilian ship didn't have life jackets for all the soldiers. They removed their jackets. They gave them to 4 young soldiers. You can imagine it's pretty cold in the North Atlantic in February 1943, by some measures 1 degree above freezing. Only about 200 of the young soldiers who were on that troop transport ship survived. But they've told the story of the immortal chaplains, immortalized on this earth for all time, for as long as we live as a nation, locking in arms. As the ship was going down, they heard prayers in English and Latin and Hebrew, praying not for themselves, but for those soldiers who were going into those icy waters that they might survive. That story has been immortalized in print and in film. It's also immortalized in a place where I spend a lot of time, at Arlington National Cemetery, in a place called Chaplain's Hill, Section 2, with more than 200 chaplains who have given their life in defense of our nation are memorialized for our country. Now, not many of us, thankfully, will be called to do what those chaplains did, to live out John 15:13. Greater love hath no man than this, that he lay down his life for his friends. But we are all called to serve our nation, to defend our faith, to lock arms together. And sometimes it may seem like an overwhelming fight beyond our mere ability as individuals to carry on. But I assure you it's not. That every one of you is here, not just on this earth, but here today for a reason, joining together. When you fly in and out of Washington, as much as I do, as much as all of us do, like we did last night, you can look to the east and you can see the giant monuments to giant men, Washington and Lincoln, Jefferson. But you can also look to the west and you can see the small monuments to equally giant Americans. The more than 400,000 souls that rest at Arlington. Those like the immortal chaplains who are memorialized there. Many of whom we will never know their name. And you can see, and you can feel when you're taking off or landing, and you see the giant monuments to the east and the small monuments to the west, the connection between the two. If it wasn't for all those souls at Arlington, the names of the giants like Washington and Lincoln wouldn't be remembered to history, because they alone didn't have it in their power to found a great nation, to keep us safe and prosperous and free. It was the men and women who were locking arms with them, the men and women who are immortalized in places like Arlington, who have made this nation possible, who have kept it free. Men and women like you who together will keep America great and free. Thank you all. God bless you. God bless the United States of America.